All right, everybody, shalom, and welcome to the Yishai Fleisher Show. Thank you so much for joining me on Facebook, on Twitter, Periscope, and on YouTube. And we're going live right now. And we're asking a very simple question. We're going to talk about the UAE, Israel, Abraham Accords alliance. But the big question of the evening is China's drive for supremacy, which is, according to Dr. Michael Duran, and you'll hear about him in a second, China's drive for supremacy is now underway in the Middle East, and it won't end there. A giant article that Dr. Doran has written in Tablet magazine is making waves, and it's really asking a question about that. The thing that we see all the time, which is it's made in China. Is China just this economic power that wants to live in peace and do its thing and will become more Western-like as it becomes bigger and richer? Or does it have hegemonic interests and goals in the Middle East and in the world and actually wants to push America down? And is that a bad thing? Right? Let's even open up the conversation on the level of what is really the human interest, and certainly from my perspective, what is Israel's interest, and from Dr. Duran's perspective, what is America's interest? Let me introduce you a little bit to one of the most erudite and knowledgeable people. If you want to understand geopolitics, you understand what's going on in the world, I don't think there's anybody better than Dr. Michael Duran, who is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute in DC, where he specializes in Middle East security issues. He's written about China recently and just published an article about Turkey as well. In the George W. Bush administration, Michael served in the White House as a senior director of at the National Security Council, was responsible for the entire Middle East except for Iraq. Before being at Hudson, Michael was a senior fellow at Brookings. He held teaching positions at NYU, Princeton, and the University of Central Florida. He's been published in a lot of newspapers and magazines, as you can imagine, and he's got an incredible book, which I haven't read yet, but my good friend Jake read from cover to cover and said it was amazing. It's about Ike's Gamble, a study in the evolution of President Eisenhower's Middle East strategy, specifically about the Sinai campaign. Michael holds a BA from Stanford and MA and Ph.D. from Princeton. Great places indeed. And it is my honor and privilege to invite Dr. Michael Duran. Michael, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. One thing that was left out of your bio was that although you're what we would lovingly call a policy wonk and a geostrategist, a geopolitical thinker, you're also an amazing Twitterer, and you have a fantastic Twitter account which is called Duranimated, right? Which is animated like Doran. And I've put it up on the screen here. Dr. Michael Duran, you call yourself fiery but peaceful. Fiery but peaceful. Is that right?
That's right. Yes, I'm just like the protests.
Yes. Okay. First thing, as we speak right now, some of your friends and colleagues and some of my friends or colleagues, including members of the press corps, are out in the Emirates. They were in Dubai yesterday. Today, they're in Abu Dhabi. And they are on what they term and what the media is terming a historic, and I think that you and I would probably agree that it is indeed historic, an Israeli Now, I'm not fond of using the term peace because we were not at war with the UAE. I like to, as Middle East out, to keep it a little bit cooler. But in any case, what is happening is accords are being signed, or at least in preparation of being signed, between these two countries. The UAE is, as we heard from Dr. Mordechai Kedar, is a kind of European Union of small Arab mini-states conglomerated together. But they're important. They are wealthy. They also seem to be leading a different Islamic outlook, which is more about technology, more about defense, more about the deal, more about prosperity, and more about understanding that Israel is part of the mosaic of the Middle East and accepting it. That's my take. What do you think about the so-called Abraham Accords?
Before we talk about that, let me just say thank you for that very generous introduction. You were making my head swell, and I wanted it to go on forever instead of listening to myself. But I agree with you about the Accords. I think it's a very big deal. It is the first time. You don't want to call it peace. Let's call it normalization. It's the first time that there's been normalization between Israel and countries that don't border it, Arab countries that don't border it. And that's a big deal. It's a huge deal that it happened despite what all of the experts said. I mean, Netanyahu and Trump, they have really developed a whole new paradigm here that everyone said could never work. Because we're hearing, it's not just the UAE. There will be follow-on agreements, presumably with Bahrain, Oman, Sudan, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, who knows? But it really has, opened up all kinds of new opportunities. I think it's very important. I think it's important for the United States as much as for Israel.
There was some hubbub in the nationalist camp here in Israel about the sovereignty issue, about Israeli sovereignty in Judea and Samaria. And that was something that Prime Minister Netanyahu promised in 3 various elections. And when today, one of my journalist friends, or yesterday on the airplane, asked Jared Kushner about it, so Jared Kushner basically demurred. He didn't say yes, he didn't say no. He just said, look, we're deal makers, and the deal, things are still open. Now, what I understand from it is that what Jared Kushner and President Trump are saying to a person like me is, look, we're trying to get Israel normalized. And the way we're trying to get it normalized is by going around the conflict issues. It's not about Judea and Samaria or about the Temple Mount or about a Hebron. It's actually about other things that we can talk together about, talk to one another about: technology, defense, push back on Iran, and kind of keep the temperature low by going around hot button issues. It's not no to sovereignty or annexation. It's just, let's not talk about these things right now. Is that how you read it?
Yes and no, but before I give you my answer, can I just ask you, how did you feel about it when they first announced it? Were you among those? I'm sorry, I didn't follow your output closely on this question. Were you among those who felt betrayed when they delayed the annexation, or were you willing to see where it was going to go?
Well, from the point of view of my job and my life, there's no question that I'm pushing hard on sovereignty, Israeli sovereignty in Judea and Samaria, Hebron being a very tough place in the heart of Judea. This is basically what I do and what my life is about. So clearly I was disappointed, but I wasn't too disappointed because I came to the realization that Netanyahu wasn't really planning on doing it in the first place. It became obvious to me that there was no plan and that he wasn't really going to do it for various reasons. And therefore, when he played it off by saying, I'm delaying it or I'm not doing it in order to get something else, I was like, okay, let's get what we can from a different angle. And since I really view, Israel in the Middle East as part of, I'd like to see Israel as part of an organic Middle East, I was able to swallow it. But of course, the long run, we will continue to push for it.
Oh, I saw him as sincere actually. I mean, not with regard to where you live, but I saw him as sincere with regard to the Jordan Valley for sure. Don't you think that that if the Americans hadn't put pressure on him, he would have gone for the Jordan Valley by July 1, like he was promising?
In many ways, for him, we have the Jordan Valley. It was going to be symbolic, and if it was going to be symbolic and costly, then it wasn't worth it. So, the Jordan Valley is, for all intents and purposes, under Israeli control. So if it was going to get him some votes and be a beautiful symbolic win, great. But if he didn't, but if it was going to be a lot of pushback, he still had control of the Jordan Valley, and he's going to get, and if he's going to upset other partners or America, whatever it is, then I can understand why he would back down. The bottom line is, I don't think Netanyahu was really going to pull the trigger, but one day it will happen. I think that Netanyahu is much more comfortable in this role as regional peacemaker, as chief technology officer and defender against, and commander in chief against Iran.
Right.
That's his role.
Yeah. You have to admit, though, that this greatly weakens the Palestinian claims, and that strengthens your position. No.
What are you referring to specifically?
Well, I mean, there was this sense that the Palestinians had veto over any kind of normalization with the wider Arab world, and that has now been destroyed.
Absolutely.
And that weakened. It also weakened. I mean, the Israeli left was building on that. The Israeli left was building on two things. It was building on the Palestinian veto, and also on the global community, America, the EU, and so on, of themselves refusing to go forward with anything unless they had Palestinian buy-in. And so that has been destroyed forever.
Absolutely. And I could tell you on a personal level of the conflicts that I face with what I understand are enemies of Israel, they're flummoxed. They're totally messed up right now. Because they see a nationalist like myself, a settler, cheering on Israeli-Arab cooperation. So the whole language of racism and all that is dead, and their whole idea that just like you explained that it's all about Palestine is dead. And in fact, I think what's coming out clear and clear is that the Palestinian Authority is a gang of thugs that is repressive, that is unproductive, and that is, what's the word I'm looking for? Regressive and not into progress. And they're just holding back the show. And you could also tell that the Arab world is fed up with them. And all these are important things.
That's great. Yeah, no, and they're fed up with the non-cooperation of the Palestinians and getting past this issue, and they're also fed up. I think really importantly with the whole resistance culture of Hamas, Muslim Brotherhood, and so on, and they want to move forward, and they have recognized that moving forward on this issue is an important aspect of diminishing those aspects of their own culture. You see what I mean? I didn't say it very well, but this is an intra-Arab and an intra-Arab cultural question as much as it is a diplomatic one, and that's what makes it so fascinating and important.
Yeah, I was thinking about it geographically, and I realized the Arabs that are right next to us, southern Lebanon, you have Hezbollah. In Gaza, you got Hamas. In Judea and Samaria, the so-called West Bank, you have the Fatah Hamas movement. And in Jordan and in Egypt, there's a lot of Israel hate. But when you move out a little bit, when you get out to a different part of the Arab world, an Arab world that clearly favors progress and the good life, and I mean, the word Western isn't the right word. It's let's just say they're not into the ideology of conflict. They're into something else. I mean, they have a Louvre, for God's sakes, and they're so proud of that, right? So, clearly they want something else. And so, yes, indeed, it's shown that the Arab world is not a united front. But let me ask you about a different united front. How much is all this about President Trump winning in November? How much is this whole thing, and I'm not asking that in a critical sense, just asking how much of this is all a play to make sure that Trump wins re-election?
Well, I think that was a big factor in the thinking of Jared Kushner and Trump, is that when the ambassador of the United Arab Emirates here in Washington, Yusuf Al-Otaiba, wrote that op-ed in which he strongly urged the Israelis not to go for annexation because they would imperil normalization. I immediately called up some friends of mine and I said, I don't understand how come the UAE is working so clearly with the Biden team to support them, because I read it as much as a domestic American position as an international position, because it did support all of the claims of the Democrats in the foreign policy arena that Trump's approach was totally misguided. It wasn't going to do anything but complicate America's relations. It was actually harming Israel's security rather than helping it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then they very quickly turned it around by moving toward the normalization to an event that actually greatly strengthens Trump. I mean, this is Trump's greatest clear, foreign policy success. I actually think his Iran policy, I think the two most important things Trump has done in the international arena is changing people's minds about China, and secondly, his Iran policy. I think his Iran policy is a great success, but it isn't the kind of success that you can stand before somebody who's maybe a little bit skeptical or who hasn't been following it, and they see it very clearly. But you can't say a breakthrough in relations between Israel and the Gulf states of this magnitude is not a success. I mean, nobody can argue that. So they handed him that, he did it himself. I mean, he had a big role in all this, but this agreement at this moment helps him. So they turned it around very quickly into a pro-Trump thing. Now, I don't think it's gonna that the American voters, for the most part, are voting on foreign policy in this election, except
for one group that cares about
evangelicals. Is that what you're going to say?
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah.
My evangelical friends tell me, they say to me, we got three issues: marriage, abortion, and Israel. Those are the issues.
They also religious freedom. I mean, right. The thing is that that Trump made a deal with them early on. I'm talking about back in 2016. He basically said to them, look, the other team hates you, and in my view, you have a position of respect in American society, and I will defend your position. Obviously, don't look too closely at the way I lead my personal life. That's not that's not the issue. The issue is I respect you. That's a deal that they took, and I think that deal would have held with or without this. But all of the things that he's done, Jerusalem, the Golan, that just it enhances his position among them. So that's fantastic. But and it just shows him to be a more competent leader than what the media was telling us. So that's all great. Personally, I read this obviously much. You're thinking about your position in Israel, and when you look at all this, I'm always reading it as from an American foreign policy point of view, and what I regard. When I look at Trump's policy toward the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or toward the Arab-Israeli conflict in general, and when I look at what he did on the Golan, Jerusalem, and now this, I see him systematically, and I think that this is very clear that this is what they're doing. They are systematically dismantling the worldview that produced UN Resolution 2334 when Obama was leaving the White House, because that was an attempt to turn the 4 June 67 armistice lines into international boundaries and to make anything that Israel has done beyond those lines illegitimate in international law. And I think that this is a very, very important project. That's why I would think maybe disagree with you a little bit on this question. You said Jordan Valley, we're in control of Jordan Valley. We're going to remain in control of the Jordan Valley. I think, from my point of view, given where we are in America and the polarization, dismantling that Obama worldview, the 2-3-3-4 worldview, that's extremely important.
Let our positions not be misunderstood. I am completely dedicated to Israeli sovereignty in the victories of the 6-Day War, what we consider the ancestral homeland, the biblical homeland, in any case, the historic homeland of Israel. And I think those are essential for security. They're essential for our narrative. And what you're saying is, in terms of what I call narrative war, it's absolutely key that Israel not only retains but asserts a kind of full narrative control of these areas.
Right.
I can't,
Israel and the United States.
Right. I can't disagree with that. I can't agree with that more. What I really meant is, and now this is a kind of meta perspective on who Netanyahu is. To me, Netanyahu is a great man who is going to be remembered as one of Israel's great leaders. If you were in Israel right now, you would see that there's a lot of people who like to poo-poo him and see his smallness, and that's the curse of all great leaders, is that they're seen as small men at the time. Maybe not all, but many. But at the same time, his victories are in what he's good at, and what I realized is he's not yet cut out for this step. All the other Trump victories that you mentioned vis-a-vis Israel, the Golan Heights. Israel asserted sovereignty over the Golan Heights in 1982, and Jerusalem being recognized. That was in 1967, 68. And my only point is, we made a step, and it took America 50 years or 40 years to recognize those things. In Israel, we have to have a leader who's ready to take that sovereignty. No amount of trumping can give sovereignty to the state of Israel. The state of Israel needs leadership that is willing to do that. And then, of course, a great leader like President Trump will be willing to recognize it. That's the short of it for Netanyahu. But I want to celebrate what he's doing now and not just see. I didn't want to be one of the people that look down at the failure of sovereignty without seeing the advantage of what he's been doing now, which is ironic given my position.
Yeah. I think in my mind, I kind of conflated your position with the position that I hear from a lot of people in the, let's call it the Israeli security establishment. What I find with Israeli sort of military types, and people who come out of that environment, is that they don't understand, in my view, the importance of what you called the narrative war. I think that the politics of all of this, and particularly the politics in the West, is extremely important. And if I'm to quibble with what you said just now, it's that you can't assume that a guy like Trump is going to come along. Right. You look at the positions that a lot of the establishment has been taking on Israel, and blaming Israel for the conflict, and then coming up with diplomatic initiatives that are based on that assumption, and international legal initiatives that are based on that assumption. And so I see here Trump blowing it all apart, and making it difficult for whoever comes after him, whatever worldview they have, to roll it back. And that I think is really valuable.
Yes, and I wrote an article that said wrote to President Trump that this peace deal, the deal of the century, is a mistake because it goes back to two-state solutionism, and it's got that in there. and that I wrote, President Trump, you're too good for the two-state solution. You're bigger than the two-state solution. You shouldn't go down that path because you're wiser than that. By the way, there's a guy right now who's he's obviously a very angry Twitterer right now, and he's writing things like this. I'm putting it up the screen. He writes, "Free Palestine." Fine. Then he says, "Love Palestine, hate Nazi Jews," and then he wrote, "Trump, great leader. What's this guy smoking?" And I wanted to just comment on that, which is, from our perspective, from the Israeli perspective, those things that you mentioned have been humongous. They've been huge. The pushback of anti-Semitism at the UN, the defunding UNESCO, which I was part of, the pushback on Iran, the recognition of Jerusalem, the recognition of the Golan Heights. There's been tremendous victories. And of course, a person like myself is very concerned about a Biden victory, because I think that would undo a lot of those things, but especially allow for Iran to become the regional power and hegemon that it seeks to be. Right. And I guess that brings us to the main topic, which we wanted to discuss, which is China. I didn't want to start exactly like this, but you've written an article, which is at the top of your Twitter feed, which is at Tablet Magazine. And you start with, "China's drive for supremacy is now underway in the Middle East, and it won't end there." And we'll get to the nitty-gritty of what you've written, but let's get to the question of Iran. Recently, Iran and China, I don't know, did they sign an agreement, or did they just announce an agreement? But they made it clear that they are in cahoots. And this was, like, for people like myself, like a wake-up moment. Like, your whole article is an effort to be a wake-up moment. Iran and China is a bad combo for in Israel in the Middle East. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, you said, did they sign an agreement? Did they announce it? The way that agreement came to the attention of everyone recently is because elements in the Iranian government leaked it to the New York Times, who then made a big deal about it. As part of the, this is how I read it, as part of the general effort to fight against Trump's efforts in the Security Council to snap back on the JCPOA, and and the step before that to make sure that the conventional arms embargo isn't lifted in terms of the JCPOA. So it was part of an international political effort to stymie Trump in the Security Council, and it misrepresented what's going on between Iran and China. That agreement that they leaked to the New York Times was already announced in January 2016, when Xi Jinping went to Tehran. So they keep reselling the donkey, but it's not that there's no donkey there. There is something going on between the Chinese and the Iranians. Exactly what it is not clear. The Chinese themselves have not discussed it openly. So we gotta wait and see. But there is a relationship clearly between the Chinese and the Iranians, and it's an extremely important one. And it's very dangerous for the United States, very dangerous for Israel. And in our article, I co-wrote the article with my colleague Peter Rao, by the way. And in the article, we said that people tend to think that China has no interest in the politics or in the diplomacy of conflict in the Middle East. It's not involved in any of the military conflicts. The Chinese say this about themselves all the time. They say, we're just there for economic reasons. We want to extract resources. We want to make economic deals, win-win. We will work with everyone. We don't pick sides, and so on. And that has been the dominant view in Washington since I was in the White House in 2016, in 2005, 2006. We collected all the information we could about what the Chinese are up to in the region, and we said that is not an accurate way to look at what they're doing. They are actually trying to oust the United States. The dominant view has said because the Chinese are interested in extracting resources, they're actually comfortable with the American order. And they're basically kind of free riders. The United States provides the security, and then they come in and they just work economically. And we said, no, it's more complicated than that. There's a contradiction at the heart of Chinese policy. On the one hand, they want to extract resources. Yes, they benefit from the American order in doing that. But on the other hand, they also want to undermine the American order. And we went through all the reasons for that.
So a commenter, a listener to the show, put up this comment. She said, this is my friend Chava. She writes, should we be concerned about Chinese investment in Israeli infrastructure? So I guess that's that's a very Israel-centered question, which we'll definitely get to because that is important. Let's just focus for a second on the nitty-gritty. You say that in foreign policy, China remains dedicated to international revolution. But the new world that they envision is not a Marxist paradise, but one in which China will replace the U.S. as the dominant power in a China-centric world order. And you write that there's three ways that they're really doing it. One is through scientific research that is subordinate to the national security apparatus. Business and scientific research subordinate to the national security apparatus. In simple terms, technology,
next generation technologies that are going to drive the global economy and that are going to drive global military innovation. Right,
and that leads you right into two, which is military modernization and expansion. And here you quote a figure, which is one of the most telling figures of them all here, which is that you say that although reliable numbers are difficult to come by, between 2000 and 2019, China's defense budget jumped fivefold from 43 million to 266. From 43 billion to 266 billion. That is a jump of at least fivefold. And the third track, you say
they are competing. Yes.
Right. And you say later on in the article that it's not to gun for gun. It's not to have exactly the submarine that'll match the submarine. It's not exactly to have the cannon that'll match the cannon. Rather, it's enough to just bully a little bit. It's enough to make America seem a little bit less likely to be there for you. It's just enough to threaten. It's just enough to be big and to be there to play ball. You don't have to match it 1-to-1. And lastly, you say that the third tack of China's strategy is political. And well, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by political?
I mean, if you look at one of the striking things when we started collecting information on this is the way they bully allies of the United States. And when I say allies, I'm not talking about far-flung allies. I'm talking about Canada, Australia, Great Britain. There's a great book, anybody who's interested in this should have a look at, by a guy named Clive Hamilton. He's a left-wing, and that's important for, authenticity, Australian journalist who started to get worried about Chinese activities in Australia. And he wrote this book called Silent Invasion. And that was a big wake-up call for me because they insinuated themselves into Australia through business ties, by buying off politicians, working with universities. And then the Chinese kind of have two modes for dealing with you. One is sort of win-win, happy panda. Here, let's make a deal. I'll make you rich. I get rich. You get rich, and they'll be kind of deferential to you. But once they think that you're dependent on them, then they start ordering you around.
Right.
And you see it all around the Pacific. This sort of heavy hand of China. And one of the ways that they do it is politically. You have to, if your company's doing business in China, you have to start being deferential to towing the line politically. Right. Look, our own NBA. You can't be a basketball player in the NBA and talk about the genocide in Xinjiang. That's it, because they have invested so much money, and they'll use that lever on you. So they have so much power. Their economy is so big, and they have reach into all of these societies now that we allowed them. Reach into research institutions. They own a chunk of our universities. So our universities are churning out all these woke students, American students who are who want to tear down the American system. Meanwhile, they're building the scientific know-how of the Chinese students and transferring it all back over to China. It's great for China to have American universities that create Marxists among the Americans and scientific leaders among the Chinese. Great.
I'm chewing on that, and it is, and maybe I want to jump the gun for a second, just because we're on the topic. So, Dr. Michael Duran, why should I care? Okay, so China's the next. So China's the big. It's the big panda in the town. All right, it's okay. So it's not America. America makes raunchy movies now, and these guys want to lead. So I'm little Israel, or I'm little Djibouti, or I'm little whatever, Canada. Like, why should I fight this tidal wave?
Oh, well, it's the United States who should fight it, but they should look for your help. And you should definitely be worried because the position of Israel. We made it. We presented in the article. I mean, as you know, we presented a picture of what the Chinese order looks like. And the truth of the matter is, I think Israel comes out okay, better than most in the Chinese order. Because Israel has a lot of capabilities that the Chinese really covet. This goes to Hava's question before. Israel is a cyber superpower. It's a global leader in next generation technologies, in artificial intelligence, and it's a leader also in military innovation. And on top of that, it has a fantastic purview into the American military-industrial complex and military innovation. And so China wants nothing more in the Middle East than to detach Israel from the United States and pull it up under the wing of China, because China's whole vision of global leadership is that mix of economic and military capabilities. And the problem that they have is that they still are largely dependent on innovation, Western-based innovation. And so they can just sort of take it from Israel, then that's fantastic. But it's going to come at a high price. And it's that thing I mentioned to you, that once they think they own you, then the Chinese communists, you don't do business with China and not do business with the Chinese Communist Party.
Right.
And they're going to start dictating to you directly. They'll get in and they'll start owning you, and you'll lose your freedom. The United States, whatever
I'm playing devil's advocate here, but people could say maybe America does a similar thing. You have to toe the American line, right?
You do, but the United States, our whole system is based on separation of the political realm and the economic realm, and it's based on freedom and democracy. And so, look.
And I think there's a key word.
If you want to have a new authoritarianism in Israel, Israel could develop an authoritarian model, but I think a lot of what we love about Israel would be squelched.
I think there's another word that you haven't said there, which is a tricky word in geopolitical analysis, but it's an important word, which is morality.
Oh yeah, sure.
The United States is still a country that has values that runs the world through an idea of values. And one gets the sense, and everybody that I know that has done business with China, has lived in China, they all tell me the same thing. It's an amoral society. It does not.
Look at what they're doing to the Uyghurs. I mean, the latest reports say there's mass incarceration and then the sterilization of the women. It is a form of genocide. They're not killing everyone in concentration camps, but they're making sure that the population is going to be fragmented and weak, and it won't reproduce itself. And they're doing it with tremendous impunity. By the way, as you know in the article, if you don't mind me telling your viewers, we demonstrated that genocide is happening for a strategic reason, and that is the push of the Chinese into the Middle East. The route by which the Chinese are coming in the Middle East is through Pakistan. Xinjiang is the hub between China and Pakistan. They don't want a potentially restive minority in that strategic territory, and so they're just crushing them with unbelievable brutality.
Let's go in even a little bit deeper into what you've written here, which is you introduced me to a port that I never heard of called Gwadar on the coast of Pakistan.
Yes.
And this is a new hub, and not so far away, across the way, is Djibouti, and these two stations basically control oil coming out of the Persian Gulf, and so or into the Red Sea, and so by controlling these 2 points, you make the case that it starts off looking like economics, but it soon becomes military, and soon you're used to having these Chinese patrol boats around there, patrolling their interests, their economic interests, and soon afterwards you have a full military presence that can both suppress oil or energy transport in a time of war, and ensure that they get it and that others won't.
Exactly. They want to do two things. They want to shorten and harden their own supply lines. They're very dependent on oil imports, and now their oil has to go all the way through the Straits of Malacca and up to their east coast, and to their only coast, obviously. And in time of war, whether it's with the United States or with Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, anybody in that what's called the first island chain, their supply route is going to be blocked if there's hostilities in that area. So they're shifting it to go by land up through Pakistan. That's the importance of the Pakistan corridor. So that shortens and hardens their lines, but at the same time they're positioning themselves to threaten the lines of all of their adversaries in Asia. That's all of the ones in the Western Pacific and also India, who are tremendously dependent on Middle Eastern oil, as dependent or more dependent than the Chinese are. So to position themselves to threaten the supply of their enemies, they've got the Djibouti base, which guards the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which, as you mentioned, guards the approaches to the Suez Canal. So all of the oil that goes from the Persian Gulf to Europe, for example, has to go through the Bab el-Mandeb and then up to the Suez Canal. But then Gwadar, in addition to being the transshipment hub up to China, it looks out to the Gulf of Oman, and it's within easy striking distance of the Strait of Hormuz. And that's part of the importance too of their relationship with Iran. They're positioning themselves. Should the United States is sending signals, about it's not sure if it wants to stay in the Middle East. So they're positioning themselves so that if the United States leaves, that they can quickly move in, and they will turn the Persian Gulf in concert with the Iranians, and the Red Sea in concert with they're using their base in Djibouti, and then other elements, maybe the port of Sudan. They'll turn the Red Sea into Chinese lakes. Red Sea, Persian Gulf. All of Israel's shipping out to Asia from Eilat will have to go through a Chinese lake in order to get that. Meanwhile, by the way, we didn't even mention it. They're also, of course, building a port, Piraeus in Greece. They're building Haifa port. And so they're positioning themselves in the Mediterranean as well. So they're kind of surrounding the Middle East. Right now, they don't want to challenge the United States directly. They don't have the military capability to do it at this moment.
Why challenge directly? Who needs to challenge directly?
They don't have that.
Right. Who needs to do that? You just boil the lobster. You do it nice and slow. That's
fine. What they're boiling the lobster. That's
it.
Yeah.
Sure. Who needs to go? Who needs to go head to head? It's a total waste of time. Who needs open conflict? Right.
Right. This is what Putin taught everyone in Putin taught everyone in Syria. It's what the Iranians have been teaching everyone. I mean, Iran's capabilities compared to the United States, they're minuscule. I mean, it's not a competitor with the United States, and yet it manages to conquer territory, and political positions all across the region, because the United States isn't playing the game intelligently.
So that's really the question. The question is, there's another, by the way, player there that you mentioned in the article, which is Russia. Maybe you just want to touch on that, and then we'll get back to the question about what the U.S. is going to be doing. We made
the argument that generally American analysts of the Middle East tend to think that Russia and Iran are playing separate games from China, and that all we have Iran has its resistance alliance on the ground, and then there's the Russia-Iranian alliance in Syria proper, and that these things have nothing to do with China. Also, we didn't go into detail. Same thing in Libya, that the Russian position in Libya has nothing to do with the Chinese position. And we said, no, actually they're in an alliance, or at least in an alignment, an entente. And the Chinese are the silent partners. They're using the Russians and the Iranians as their stalking horses, because the Americans think, oh, the problem is the Russians and the Iranians, and they don't feel particularly threatened by it, because we always know that in the event of a really serious conflict, we can wipe the floor with the Russians and the Iranians. So the Iranians have taken some positions inside Iraq or whatever. It's not that big of a deal. But we said, no, actually, this is an alliance that is led by China. If you look at the GNP, all the global influence, China is the senior leader, and it's using these guys on the ground because it's not ready to have a direct conflict with the United States.
And it doesn't need to. It's important to make that statement again. Old school war is, if you're able to erode the American society's will to be engaged in global hegemony, you teach them so-called America firstness. And you made a little snipe, you made a little remark at President Trump that he too is part of in one sense, of a shrinking American influence. But we'll get to that in a second. The point is that if China,
I'd put it slightly differently, but
I'm just making the point that if China can make America shrink its global position and itself excel it through technology, through another boat, through another alliance, and slowly but surely, open conflict is just unnecessary and actually galvanizes the other side. Instead, keep them sleeping.
Right. That's what they're doing now. The main goal of the article, as I understood it, like I said, it was co-authored, but as I understood it, it was to put a certain picture of the game board in front of particularly American readers. That was because we wanted them to see, one, the Middle East is the second most important region to China. Number two, there's a hard power competition with the United States going on in the Middle East. They're engaging in it in a stealthy way, like you're suggesting, but it's going on for sure. Number three, they're in an alliance with the Russians and the Iranians. And number four, they're using their economic power in concert with their hard military power directly. It's not; these things are not disconnected in any way. And maybe add a fifth to that, which is that the game is they've collected a lot of positions on the board that we're not even aware of. I mean, there were things that I wasn't aware of. I consider myself a Middle East expert. I didn't realize that between 2010 and 2018, they had increased their investment in Iraq by over 1,000%. This is one of the areas where I think it's really obvious that they're working with the Iranians. The Iranians, with their militias on the ground, have made it impossible for American companies to do business. Meanwhile, the Chinese have come in and they're doing business like gangbusters. And the two of them are detaching Iraq from the American order, or making sure that it never got really fully absorbed into the American order. I think it's very clever how they worked hand in glove without anyone ever suggesting that they were doing this. In fact, I went around to a lot of friends of mine who were experts and said, in what Arab country have the Chinese in the last 10 years increased their investment by 1,000%? Nobody said Iraq. Nobody was even aware of it. In fact, given the goofy way the Americans see all this with China traditionally, where we tell ourselves the Chinese are comfortable with the American order, they kind of got credit from us because they helped to build Iraq, which was seen in Washington as an American project. So they weren't seen because they didn't challenge us on the security or political front. They let the Iranians do that. They get credit for all the investment that they're putting into the country.
So we're seeing an axis develop. We're seeing some axis develop. You're saying not necessarily in concert, but at least an alignment. You got Russia and China. You got Iran. You got Pakistan. You got a takeover of Iraq. And so to build a counter axis, which is, I guess, United States, Israel, India, and
Saudi Arabia,
right, and countries that are afraid of Iran, like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, etc. The Gulf states that have not the non-jihadist Gulf states, as opposed to, for example, Kuwait and Qatar that are still holding on to some jihadist ideology there, which I don't know, if they would line up with China as well. But I guess altogether, if it's an anti-American, anti-Israeli axis, why not? Get all the players on board.
I see it a little differently. What you just described is sort of the kind of Cold War, model. I see it slightly differently, but without going into the nuances there, I just say that, every China is now the number one trade partner of every Arab country, or almost everyone, and certainly all of the most important ones, the most powerful ones. I don't know exactly where it is with Israel. It's like probably number 3 with Israel, depending on how you calculate it. They're making a play for Israel for sure. We had some kind of hidden, and I say hidden. I didn't want to push the politics of all this too significantly, because I just wanted people to start seeing the game board and to see how much influence the Chinese now have, sort of in latent military capability, and to understand that all that the United States has, the United States cannot match the Chinese move for move economically. We don't have the money that they have to invest. First of all, we're not dependent on oil, so we can't make all of these purchases of oil. What we have is our hard power. And so we were sending a message to people on the left, to people who are inclined to vote for Biden, that this idea that Obama had of reaching out to the Iranians and cutting a deal with the Iranians and with the Russians and all that, sharing the region with the Russians and the Iranians, that was just actually advancing the Chinese project, because it allows the Iranians to have it all, to have economic relations with the West and with the United States, into the arms embargo, and they can have the military relationship with the Chinese, and so forth. Same thing with the Russians, and the left has also sold itself on this idea that what's really successful about American diplomacy is the soft power, and we're saying, look, in the Middle East, it's all about hard power, and what the United States has done by strengthening the Iranians, what it did under Obama, by strengthening the Iranians, strengthening the Russians, while simultaneously sending the message that it really wants to get the hell out of the Middle East. We encouraged Saudi Arabia and Israel and everybody else to hedge toward China, because if you're the Saudis and you see the Americans hectoring you all the time, hectoring you about Yemen, hectoring you about democracy, hectoring you about your just the very nature of your regime, while simultaneously saying, and we're thinking about getting the hell out. Well, what choice do you have? Then you're going to start working with Beijing, because Beijing is the only player that you can look to maybe protect you against the Iranians. So the Chinese are using with one hand they're building up Iran, to whack at Saudi Arabia. And on the other hand, they're reaching out to sort of help Saudi Arabia against Iran. The answer is for the United States to move in and guarantee the security of Saudi Arabia, guarantee the security of Israel, but say, look, with that guarantee comes a cost, and the cost is you cannot do business, certain kinds of business with China. We understand we can't say you can't do no business, but you can't do business that's going to help them with their goal to become the leading technological power in the global leader in technological innovation. And also, you can't work with them in the security realm. And now this hasn't been worked out. I think the negotiations are really getting serious now with the Israelis, between the Americans and the Israelis, about, well, what is strategic trade versus non-strategic trade? That's a very difficult question, but that's the key question. But we're not going to get that agreement with our allies unless we guarantee them security. And in that, there's also a message to the Trump team, because there's a stream of thought within Trump world that says, we don't need the Middle East anymore. Let's just, we're oil self-sufficient. The people who need the Middle Eastern oil should worry about the Middle East. And we're saying, no, if the Chinese come in, they take over the Middle East, then that's going to position them globally to detach Europe from the United States, to detach Africa completely from the West, and basically to turn all of Eurasia and Africa into a Chinese system.
So a Biden victory would more or less ensure that what you just said, which is that detachment, that Chinese hegemony, etc.
I think so. I'm not sure. It would not necessarily guarantee, because I think the left can wake up to the Chinese threat. The left woke up to the Chinese threat in Australia. I think even in America, it might wake up to that in this regard. But they still, if you look at the Biden platform is Obama 2.0 with regard to all the stuff that I think really matters in the Middle East, like Iran. They want to go back to. They're so demoralized by the UAE Israel agreement, because they want to go back to peace processing between the Palestinians and the Israelis, hammering on the Israelis, hammering on the Saudis. Saudis are bad because of Yemen. Israel's bad because of people like you, Yishai, and the settlements, and reaching out in friendship to this disgusting regime in Tehran.
So now let's talk. Let's finish up here and just talk about. I wanted to make one tiny point, which is, I don't think that the right way to say it is that Israel and Saudi Arabia need U.S. security protection. I would say more like empower. I'd like to think that we can be empowered to be the defense contractor for the United States in this region for countries like Saudi Arabia. To me, I see Saudi Arabia and the UAE turning to Israel saying, hey, you protect us and we'll give you normalization. We'll give you other things. I think we could also demand of them to swallow the Palestinian problem one way or another by saying, okay, we'll defend you from Iran, but you just gotta clean up this Palestinian problem one way or another. There's a few different ways to do it. But we want that off the table. We want that issue off the table. And we will be the defense contractor with big United States as the guarantor, but the local security. What did I say? How did I say it? The local security contractor would be Israel.
I think there's an element of that in here for sure. I wouldn't overplay it though, and Israel needs the backing of the U.S. Against Russia and China. Once it's true that Israel was engaged in a lot of activities in Syria under Obama as well, but it got a lot easier under Trump, right? Mm-hmm. Once it knew that the U.S. was there, and sending a message to the Russians that if the Russians were to escalate against the Israelis, they'd have America to deal with as well, and also with our economic power. I mean, we have really we've really flattened Iranian economy, also the Syrian and Lebanese economy. All of that makes for an easier playing field for Israel. Not to take away anything that to take away anything that Israel's doing. I think, yeah. Yep. It's more like the model by which the Israelis defeated the Egyptians in '73. The Americans didn't do it, but you need America there to make sure that the Russians can't come in and make your life impossible.
Right, but had we also kicked butt in the day after the 6-Day War, where they started the war of attrition, and would have said absolutely not, we will smash you at first instance. Had we been tough at the day after, I don't think we would have come down to the Yom Kippur War, to the 73 War. All right. In any case, final question. First thing is, what scares me about it.
Can I stop you there?
Go ahead.
Are we on a time? No, we can. I never heard that interpretation before, because my reading of the war of attrition is that you did kick butt quite significantly, and I see all of the. I read the Sinai disengagement after the 73 war and everything as an example. Even the 73 war was an effort by Sadat to get out of the war, get out of the wars, and as a result of the power that you showed in the war of attrition. Is this your own personal interpretation, or is there some Israeli historian who's made this argument? Because I never heard it before.
Look, it really, I think you and I over a steak in Jerusalem once argued about this a few years ago, but people like myself see the Sinai Accords as the father, how do we call it in American language, the original sin, right?
Yeah.
People like myself would have liked to see a bigger Israel, a bolder Israel. I remember Israel under Sinai under Israeli control. I don't think, by the way, historically, Sinai was ever Egyptian. Remember in the Bible, when you left Egypt, you went to Sinai because it was a different place. So to me, Sinai, and if you want to get theological, we won a part of the Sinai in 1948 and 56 and 67. I think we were meant to hold on to it. I think that giving it away was a mistake. Also, in the Sinai Accords, which was under Carter, I mean, speaking of original sin, and so. Here you have in the Sinai Accords is where the idea of Palestinian autonomy comes in. And so to me, a smaller Israel is less good. An Israel controlling oil fields, controlling both the Suez and the Gulf of Eilat or Gulf of Aqaba is better. And so, I would have liked to see that kind of Israel. But
I was just asking specifically about your interpretation.
The war of attrition was, we won the 6-Day War, and the next day when they started a war against us, we signaled to them that that we had enough with that previous war. And we had finished that war of attrition off very quickly, I think we would have been in a different place. What is the Yom Kippur War if not their belief that they could surprise us, they could get land from us? And by the way, I want to tell you something about Egypt. To this very day, even with the peace deal with Egypt, and this is what I warned about the UAE, we have to have a warm peace. It's not enough to have a piece of paper. We have to have real tourism, real exchange. In Egypt is still a country that teaches anti-Semitism. They're this close to having a Muslim Brotherhood takeover. The country's full of Israel hate. So that's not the kind of thing that we want. We want a real so-called peace, or a real warmth. Really to be accepted into the family of Semitic nations in the Middle East.
Well, that's one of the potentials of the UAE deal is right. That it goes, as you mentioned, there is this whole project, not just to normalize diplomatic relations with Israel, but a kind of rethinking of Arab and Muslim history that opens up a space for Israel being a legitimate part of it, which is kind of exciting. We'll see where it goes.
I think it's
I mean, I'm not the first one to say this. You see it in all the commentary, but there's a real potential for economic partnership that isn't really there with Egypt and Jordan, just because of the structural differences in the economies.
Absolutely. We're very excited about that. Okay. The only thing that in all the stuff that you said, which makes a lot of sense, and Michael Duran, Dr. Michael Duran, you're really a preeminent scholar of geopolitics, especially.
I'm only a preeminent, isn't it? Am I not the preeminent?
I said the preeminent.
I heard
A. No,
A. I heard A. Yeah. I was
Well, I don't want
disappointed,
to because you co-wrote that article. I don't want to give your colleague a heart attack. You are
No.
the preeminent scholar of Middle East and also a geopolitical understanding. You have
Thank you. You're too kind.
Fabulous titles, including being a senior fellow at Hudson in D.C. You worked for President George Bush as senior director in National Security Council. You've taught in a lot of different places, including NYU and Princeton. You have your Ph.D. from Princeton. You have an excellent book that everybody should check out called Ike's Gamble, which is a great analysis of the Sinai campaign and Eisenhower's pressures surrounding that issue. You've done a great job of analyzing for us. The only thing that scares me is it really kind of depends a lot on this election. Like the way you put it is like the chess pieces are such that if President Trump does not win it kind of starts to shift in a completely different direction. It's not
I won't hide my feelings on that. I see it that way. I think this is the most important election of my adult lifetime. Yeah.
Wow.
When you see the nonsense that's going on here, there are these forces on the left that the mainstream left doesn't want to admit that are really trying to take our whole system down, and I don't think they will succeed. But I'm amazed as I watch it to see how much leeway the mainstream left is giving to these really destructive forces. And by the way, all those destructive forces hate Israel. They hate Israel. This is a lot of your co-religionists are going like this, and they don't want to see it. Right?
You're being too kind when you and I both know that the so-called co-religionists are not closing their eyes, but they're leading a lot of the causes on the other side.
Oh no, I wouldn't go. No, I wouldn't go that far.
Okay, that's fine.
I'll leave those kinds of statements to you.
To the co-religionists.
If I had to keep on, maybe I could say that.
That's right. No, but that's Jewish people are always leading isms on both sides of the aisle. That's part of what they do. But in any case, Michael, I want to wish you a lot of success. And I guess for me, I got to ask a personal question. As Yishai Fleisher, as a person who's out here trying to help craft our policy in Israel, China's knocking on the door. What do I do? Do I tell them to go to hell, or do I continue to work with them in some way? And you were hinting at that before. How do we navigate without going into open conflict and without rejecting the opportunities for development?
Like with a 12-step program, the first thing is to admit that there's a problem. I think Israelis, and they're not alone in this. I think everyone, including the Americans, were not awake. They weren't alert to the problem. The second thing is, I think the first discussion is not to have with the Chinese, it's to have with the Americans. We have to come up with our partners, particularly partners like Israel, that we're military partners, economic partners, intelligence partners, and next generation technology partners. Australia, Israel, Britain, we need to come to an agreement about what is strategic and non-strategic trade. That discussion has started, but we still haven't defined it. It's a very hard thing to do because of the nature of global supply chains and the complexity of all these gadgets we have and everything. Once that's defined, then it gets a lot easier. It gets a lot easier to have the discussion with the Chinese because you know where the red lines are.
So establish red lines, and articles like yours not only help us establish red lines, but also help us understand the playing field, what's on the chessboard, who's who, what do they want, and not to fall for what you call, hold on, it's on page 1 here, what you call, here's your wonderful term, which is harmonic convergence. Not to believe in this idea that China's all about economy and they don't care about politics and they don't care.
Yeah, it's a materialist interpretation of history. I know I don't have to convince you that there's more to history than just money. The ideas matter, and people's self-definition matters. Their identities matter. The other thing that Israel can do, and it's really important, is to help. But Israel has to be clear about this itself, to help the Americans understand what their role is in the Middle East. And that's really important. And a power like Israel, a leader like Netanyahu, I think can do that. If he has a leader like Trump, who, Trump has some inclinations that I think are not particularly healthy, like let's just get the hell out of the whole region.
Right.
And I think he's of two minds. I think he's trying to just move the system, but he has that inclination. Another one he has, when the Iranians hit the Abqaiq refinery in Saudi Arabia, Trump's attitude was, well, they didn't kill any Americans, so we don't need to do anything about it. And there was not to see that downing an American drone, hitting an American ally with impunity like that, threatening the global supply of oil, that is a way of undermining America. And I'm not saying that, I'm saying that I think Trump's reluctance to use American military power, reluctance to repeat the mistakes of George W. Bush, these are healthy things, but it can go too far. That whole thing that you and I were talking about the United States giving backing, a certain amount of backing from the United States is necessary in order to get the most out of actors like Israel, Saudi Arabia. I would include Turkey in that. We didn't mention Turkey. But if America doesn't give them, if it's sending this message all the time that, oh, maybe we're just going to get the hell out, then it's not going to get the most out of its allies. So Trump, has a sense that a lot of people have taken American support for granted, and he wants to make it very transactional. I think helping him understand, and not just him, any American leader, what the nature of that transaction is and how to make it work best for all of us. That's extremely important because Americans don't understand the Middle East naturally. The rules of the game in the Middle East are a little bit different than they are in Europe or in Asia. It's very easy to lose your way and start, sending pallets of cash to the Iranians and thinking that you're making the world a better place by doing that.
At least Trump has an understanding of what China is, and that the United States is in conflict with China. At least he's got that going for him.
Well, this is what makes him, in answer to the guy who, Mr. Free Palestine at the beginning, who said, Trump's not a great leader. Trump understands all the big things, and he understands that a president doesn't have to be involved in all the little things. We don't. When I was in the White House, we had an intelligence unit that was dedicated to examining, the building in places like Hebron, where you are, in Ma'ale Adumim, to look seriously. I kid you not, to look at the backyards of the units to see if they had tricycles in them or not, right? Was this Ribui TV or not? Was it just, were they building units were they building units that are empty, or in order to bring in settlers from outside, or were these homes that were actually inhabited by families that were growing? Think about that. That is a dedication of major resources on that question. Is that a strategic question? It's crazy.
No, we have bigger strategic things than to concern ourselves with the Jewish people making their lives again in Judea. That should be a green light, and there are things that should be red lighted. Thank you, Michael, for a wonderfully important discussion. You've really helped us see the playing field. And just that in itself is so healthy, because there's a lot of players today who, as you said before, have learned from the Soviet-style thinking and the Iranian thinking, the chess thinking, to play the subversion game. The subversion game is one of the big games that we live in today. We live in a world of information and also
Yeah.
disinformation, and quiet actors who have a long vision, who don't need to make big declarations, but understand the strategic board and make their moves in a real way. They have an advantage, and you give us an advantage by really helping us understand and analyze the situation. I want to thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure.
Michael Duran, ladies and gentlemen, a real neches. What do you know that word neches in Hebrew? A neches, a real asset. That's the word. A real asset for us. Thank you so much for being with us and helping us.
I've been called an ass many times.
And your article is here at Tablet Mag. It's a Tablet magazine, and it's called China, Middle East Kingdom. And you can find it also at the very top of your very exciting and fun and widely followed Twitter feed, which is Duranimated, right? Which is animated, Michael Duran. Duranimated. I put it up on the screen, and everybody should definitely join you. So thanks so much again for being with us.
Thank you, Yishai. Great to see you.
All right, folks, you are listening to Yishai Fleisher. What a great privilege it was to speak with Michael. And this is part of our series of doing interviews about the situation, about a region. You know, we do our Wednesday Torah discussion about the Bible and about spirituality, but we also need geopolitics. When you fuse those things together, you get a real worldview. And for us, for people like myself, Israel is at the center, right? And that's our project, which is to build up the Jewish state in the land of Israel. And as usual, as it was in the First Temple and in the Second Temple periods, we're between great powers that yearn for their place and their place in history and in the world. And we got to learn to navigate those things in ourselves, I think, and I hope become a great power. But in Israel's case, a spiritual superpower. Thank you so much for joining me. Write me an email, yishai@yishaifleisher.com or yishai@thelandofisrael.com. Come to our website, yishaifleisher.com, for articles, for tweets, for audio and for video, and for a lot of good surprises, and including retweeting people like Michael Duran, who gives us so much perspective on the world. Thanks so much for joining me, everybody, and shalom.